Today we are going to explore one of the most mysterious and devastating weapons in military history, a secret kept for centuries that saved an entire empire from destruction and changed the course of Western civilization. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. At the beginning of the 8th century of the Christian era, on the shores of the Bosphorus Strait, there stood a city that represented everything that remained of an ancient world. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was the last bastion of a civilization that had once ruled the entire Mediterranean world. Its inhabitants still considered themselves Romans, heirs to an imperial tradition that dated back more than 1,000 years. However, at that specific moment in history, that heritage seemed to be on the verge of being extinguished forever. An unprecedented invading force was approaching its walls, determined to erase from the face of the earth what remained of the ancient Eastern Roman Empire. The situation in which the empire found itself was one of extreme vulnerability. Decades of internal conflicts had exhausted the military and financial resources of the Byzantine state. Coups d'état followed one another with alarming frequency, and the imperial throne had become a prize disputed by ambitious generals and rival political factions. While the Byzantines consumed their energies in internecine struggles, a new power was emerging from the sands of the Arabian desert, sweeping everything before it with a speed that left the Mediterranean world stupefied. The Umayyad Caliphate, heir to the movement started by the Prophet Mahomet just a few decades earlier, had conquered a territory that extended from the borders of India to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Persia, North Africa, Spain, all these regions had fallen before the apparently irresistible advance of the Muslim forces. And now, in the year 717, the supreme objective of this campaign of conquest was finally within reach. Constantinople, the city of cities, the beating heart of Eastern Christianity, would be the next target. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, it is necessary to go back a little in time and examine the origins of a conflict that had been developing for generations. Fire, a primordial and ambiguous element, had accompanied humanity since its beginnings. A source of heat and light in homes, an instrument of destruction on battlefields, fire has always exerted an irresistible fascination over the human imagination. And at some point lost in the mists of antiquity, men discovered that this element could be domesticated and transformed into a weapon of war. The oldest records of the military use of incendiary substances date back to Assyria, where reliefs from the 9th century before Christ show warriors firing flaming arrows and throwing explosive pots against enemy walls. As the centuries passed, this primitive technology was refined and developed by various civilizations of the ancient world. In India, military treatises such as the Arthashastra documented the advances being made in the area of incendiary weapons, while legal codes such as the laws of Manu attempted to establish limits for their devastating use. In the Mediterranean world, where our story unfolds, Greeks and Romans also experimented with different flaming compounds. A notable example occurred during the Peloponnesian War, when forces from Boeotia employed a kind of primitive flamethrower against an Athenian garrison. The device consisted of a tube through which air was blown over a container containing burning coal, pitch, and sulfur, projecting a stream of fire against enemy fortifications. It was an ingenious weapon for its time, but still limited in range and effectiveness. The true technological leap would come from the lands of the Middle East, where the Parthian and Sassanid empires developed mixtures based on naphtha, a petroleum derivative abundant in that region. These substances proved to be highly flammable and relatively easy to transport, a combination that made them ideal for use in sieges and naval battles. The Byzantines, whose empire bordered these eastern powers, were not slow to take notice of these innovations and to begin their own experiments. It is in this context of technological evolution and external military pressure that the figure of Kalinico of Heliopolis emerges. Historical sources paint a fragmentary portrait of this man, but the general outlines of his story can be reconstructed. Kalinico was probably an architect or engineer of Greek origin who lived in the Syrian city of Heliopolis, present-day Baalbek in Lebanon. When Muslim forces conquered the region in the mid-7th century, Kalinico found himself among the thousands of Christian refugees who fled to Byzantine territory. What Kalinico brought with him to Constantinople was more valuable than gold or jewels. It was a formula, a recipe for a new incendiary substance that far surpassed anything the world had seen until then. Byzantine chroniclers would later attribute the discovery to divine intervention, stating that an angel had revealed the secret to the Emperor Constantine. This version certainly pleased the rulers of the empire, who wished to shroud their secret weapon in a mantle of mystery and sacredness. The probable reality is more prosaic, yet no less fascinating. Kalinico was possibly an heir to the knowledge accumulated by the chemical school of Alexandria, a tradition of experimentation and speculation about the nature of matter that dated back to Hellenistic times. It is possible that he refined existing recipes or combined ingredients in innovative ways, thus arriving at the composition that would go down in history under the name of Greek fire. The exact composition of Greek fire remains one of the great mysteries of military history. The Byzantines guarded this secret with a zeal that bordered on paranoia, compartmentalizing the knowledge in such a way that no single person knew all the details of the manufacturing and utilization process. The operators of the weapons knew only how to handle them. The chemists who prepared the mixture did not know how it would be employed in battle, and so on. This extreme precaution explains why, even when enemies managed to capture equipment and even quantities of the substance, they were never able to reproduce it. Modern historians and chemists have proposed various theories about the ingredients of Greek fire. Most agree that the base was probably naphtha or some other petroleum derivative, mixed with resins from pine or other coniferous trees to increase adhesion. Quicklime, a white powder obtained by burning limestone, may have been added to produce an exothermic reaction upon contact with water, explaining the most astonishing characteristic of Greek fire, its ability to burn on the surface of the water and intensify when they tried to put it out with it. Sulfur, a substance known since antiquity for its acrid odor and flammable properties, was also likely part of the mixture. What made Greek fire truly revolutionary, however, was not just its chemical composition, but the complete system developed to use it in combat. The Byzantines created a complex apparatus that functioned like a pressurized flamethrower, something the world would not see again for many centuries. At the heart of this system was a large bronze container that held the incendiary mixture. This tank was heated from below using bellows and a flame, not to ignite the contents, but to reduce its viscosity and facilitate the flow through the tubes. When the proper temperature was reached, air was pumped into the interior of the container through an inlet tube, pressurizing the chamber. The operator then opened an outlet valve, and the heated and pressurized liquid gushed through a directable nozzle. At the tip of this nozzle burned a pilot flame that ignited the jet of liquid as it emerged, creating a tongue of fire that could reach distances of up to 30 meters. The nozzle was mounted on a pivot that allowed it to be directed in an arc of approximately 60 degrees, sweeping the battlefield with burning flames. The operation of this equipment required a team of 2 or 3 specially trained men, known as siphoneers. One controlled the heating bellows, another operated the pressurization pump, and the third handled the release valve and the directable nozzle. The coordination between these operators was crucial for the efficient functioning of the weapon. It is presumed that an officer supervised the process and gave the command to fire, using for the first time in history the word that would become universal: fire. Once tested and perfected on land, these devices were installed on Byzantine warships, transforming them into the fearsome vessels that the enemies of the empire would learn to fear above all others. The most common type of ship used was the dromon, a war galley that represented an evolution of the naval designs inherited from classical Rome. Lighter and more maneuverable than its predecessors, the dromon was propelled by both lateen sails and oars, allowing for speed and tactical flexibility. The large siphons of Greek fire were typically mounted on the prow of these vessels, protected by shields, and often placed at the top of a tower that provided better range and protection for the operators. Over time, additional devices began to be installed also on the sides and at the stern of the ships, transforming a fully equipped dromon into a virtually impregnable floating fortress. Any enemy vessel that approached too closely would encounter a wall of flames impossible to cross. In addition to the large naval siphons, the Byzantines developed smaller and more portable variants of the weapon. Hand grenades made of ceramic, filled with the incendiary mixture, could be thrown against enemies in land or naval battles. Archaeologists have discovered examples of these projectiles in various sites of the ancient empire. Even smaller versions, known as kyrosiphons, functioned as portable flamethrowers that could be operated by a single soldier, anticipating by more than 1,000 years the flamethrowers used in modern wars. The arrival of this new weapon into Byzantine hands could not have occurred at a more opportune moment. The Umayyad Caliphate, after consolidating its territorial conquests, again turned its attention to Constantinople. A first attempt at a siege had been launched between the years 672 and 678, when an Arab fleet established a base on the Cyzicus Peninsula and maintained an intermittent blockade of the Byzantine capital. It was during this conflict that Greek fire debuted in combat, with devastating results for the attackers. Byzantine sources describe scenes of apocalyptic horror when the fire ships first went into action. Arab vessels were suddenly engulfed in flames that no amount of water could extinguish. Panicked sailors threw themselves into the sea, only to discover that the waves themselves burned around them. The admiral of the Arab fleet was killed along with a large part of his men, and the survivors fled in disorder, taking with them stories that would spread throughout the Muslim world. The Byzantine victory in this first siege was so complete that the Umayyads were forced to accept a humiliating truce, committing themselves to paying annual tribute to the empire they had tried to destroy. For 3 decades, an uneasy peace prevailed between the two powers. The Byzantines took advantage of this interval to consolidate their defenses and expand their fleet of fire ships, while the Arabs directed their energies to other fronts, conquering North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. But the obsession with Constantinople never disappeared. The city represented the last great prize still out of the reach of the Caliphate, and its conquest would bring immense prestige to whoever achieved it. According to Islamic tradition, he who participated in the taking of the Byzantine capital would have all his sins forgiven. This combination of material and spiritual incentives guaranteed that sooner or later another attempt would be made. The opportunity arose in the first decades of the 8th century, when the Byzantine Empire plunged again into a crisis of political instability. The imperial throne changed hands 7 times in little more than 2 decades, each transition marked by violence and bloodshed. Meanwhile, the Umayyad Caliphate reached the height of its power under the command of capable and ambitious rulers. The Caliph Valide began preparations for a decisive offensive against Constantinople, but died before he could execute his plans. His successor, Sulayma, continued the project with renewed enthusiasm. The force assembled for this second attempt was of an unprecedented magnitude. Historical sources vary in their estimates, but even the most conservative numbers speak of a land army of 80,000 men, accompanied by a fleet of 1,800 ships, carrying tens of thousands of additional soldiers. The command of this colossal force was given to Maslama, brother of the Caliph, and an experienced general who had dedicated years to the preparation of the campaign. The Arab advance through Byzantine Anatolia was methodical and relentless. Fortresses were captured, garrisons massacred, and entire populations fled ahead of the invading army. In the summer of 717, the Arab vanguards reached the vicinity of Constantinople and began to build siege lines to isolate the city by land. The fleet followed by sea, preparing to block all the maritime routes that kept the capital supplied. On the Byzantine side, the situation was one of extreme precariousness. The reigning emperor, Theodosio III, was a weak ruler who had reached the throne more by chance than by merit. Recognizing his own incapacity, he abdicated in favor of an ambitious general named Leão, who had demonstrated remarkable skill in delaying the Arab advance through Anatolia. Crowned as Leão III in March of 717, the new emperor had only a few months to prepare his capital for the approaching assault. Leão proved himself equal to the challenge. With almost superhuman energy, he supervised the repair and reinforcement of the famous Theodosian walls, the formidable triple fortifications that had protected Constantinople by land, since the 5th century. Each tower was equipped with war machines, ammunition depots, and adequate garrisons. Food supplies were stockpiled in sufficient quantity to sustain the population during a prolonged siege, and perhaps most important of all, the fleet of fire ships was prepared for the approaching battle. When Maslama finally arrived at the walls of Constantinople with his immense army, he found a city very different from the easy prey he expected. The fortifications were formidable, the defenders were well organized, and the emperor demonstrated an unshakable determination. Even so, the numbers were overwhelmingly in favor of the attackers. Chroniclers estimate that the defenders did not exceed 15,000 men, against an invading force that could reach 200,000 when all contingents were added up. Maslama built a double line of stone walls around his own camp, protecting his forces both from Byzantine counterattacks and from any relief force that might arrive from the interior of the empire. Leão, in a bold diplomatic maneuver, offered to pay a gold coin for every inhabitant of the city in exchange for the lifting of the siege. The Arab general refused with contempt. The city would fall, and with it the last vestiges of Roman hegemony in the eastern Mediterranean. The next step in the Arab strategy was to establish a complete naval blockade. Constantinople was a city surrounded by water on 3 of its sides, and any successful siege would depend on cutting its maritime supply lines. The Arab fleet received orders to position itself in a way to prevent any ship traffic to or from the Byzantine capital. It was at this moment that Leão decided to reveal his hidden card. When the Arab ships began to move to assume their blockade positions, a Byzantine squadron emerged apparently from nowhere and attacked the rear of the invading fleet. What happened next was forever engraved in the memory of the Arab survivors. From the prows of the Byzantine ships, bronze dragon heads gleamed in the sun. From their open mouths, jets of liquid fire began to gush over the nearest Arab vessels. 20 heavily loaded troop transports exploded in flames almost instantly. More than 2,000 soldiers died in a matter of minutes. Many of them drowned when they tried to escape the hell that was spreading across the surface of the waters. The panic that seized the Arab fleet was absolute. The sailors who had not been hit directly saw their companions being consumed by flames impossible to extinguish, flames that seemed to feed on the very water that should have put them out. The rumors about what had happened in the siege 40 years earlier were true, terribly true. The dragons of Constantinople were real. From that moment on, the Arab fleet refused to approach the city. There was no order or threat that could convince those sailors to face again the infernal fire of the Byzantine ships. The planned blockade became impossible to maintain. Supplies continued to arrive freely at the capital by sea, while even the local fishermen could continue their activities as if no siege were in progress. The situation of the besieging army deteriorated rapidly. The winter of 717 to 718 was exceptionally harsh, with snow covering the ground for more than 3 months. For soldiers born and raised in the heat of Arabia and Egypt, these conditions were almost unbearable. Thousands died from cold and related diseases. The long supply line that connected the army to Syria proved inadequate for the needs of such a large force, especially when Byzantine ships and local pirates began to intercept the convoys that tried to follow the coast. The chroniclers describe scenes of increasing despair in the Arab camp. When the food ran out, the soldiers were forced to slaughter their pack and riding animals. Camels, horses, and donkeys were consumed until none remained. Some accounts state that the besiegers went as far as eating tree bark, roots, and even more repugnant substances in their desperation to survive. The spring of 718 brought a ray of hope for the Arab forces. A large Egyptian fleet arrived, carrying 50,000 reinforcement soldiers and desperately needed supplies. However, this hope was short-lived. A large part of the crews of these ships was composed of Coptic Christians who had no particular loyalty to the caliphate. Upon sighting the Byzantine fleet and its fearsome fire weapons, these crews began to desert en masse, going over to the side of the Emperor Leão. Informed by these deserters about the disposition and vulnerabilities of the enemy fleet, Leão launched a series of devastating attacks. Fire ships fell upon the newly arrived Egyptians like wolves upon a flock, setting vessel after vessel on fire. The supplies that should have saved the besieging army were destroyed or captured. The situation of the Arabs became truly desperate. To make matters even worse, a completely unexpected threat emerged at their backs. The Bulgars, a people of Turkic origin who had established a powerful kingdom on the northern borders of the Byzantine Empire, had entered into negotiations with Leal. In exchange for payments in gold and other concessions, they agreed to attack the Arab army. When the Bulgar cavalry descended upon the weakened besiegers, the result was a massacre. Some accounts state that 30,000 Arab soldiers were killed in this attack alone. Cornered between the impenetrable walls of Constantinople ahead, the fire ships at sea, and the Bulgars at their backs, Maslama had no other choice but to order the retreat. On August 15, 718, exactly 1 year after the start of the siege, what remained of the largest army ever assembled by the Umayyad Caliphate began its long and humiliating march back home. The retreat was almost as disastrous as the siege itself. Bulgar and Byzantine forces pursued the survivors, attacking and dispersing entire units. The fleet, or what remained of it, faced devastating storms on the way back, losing even more ships and men. When the survivors finally arrived in Syria, they represented only a fraction of the colossal force that had set out so confidently a year earlier. Some estimates suggest that only 10% of the original force survived to tell the story. The impact of this Byzantine victory was immense and lasting. The Umayyad Caliphate never fully recovered from the disaster at Constantinople. The loss of so many men and resources contributed to the instability that would eventually lead to the fall of the dynasty and its replacement by the Abbasids, who moved the capital of the Caliphate from Damascus to Baghdad and never again seriously attempted to conquer the Byzantine Empire. Muslim expansion into Eastern Europe was effectively blocked for centuries, allowing Orthodox Christian civilization to develop and flourish in regions that might otherwise have been Islamized. The fire ships continued to serve the Byzantine Empire for many generations after this triumph. When a fleet of Russian invaders appeared before Constantinople in the year 941, the bronze dragons once again emerged to defend the city. The Emperor Romano, informed of the enemy approach while most of his navy was engaged on other fronts, ordered that old decommissioned ships be quickly equipped with Greek fire siphons. These improvised vessels proved to be more than sufficient. The chroniclers of that time left vivid accounts of the terror that Greek fire inspired in those who faced it for the first time. The Russians, seeing the flames spreading over the water and engulfing their ships, threw themselves into the sea in despair, preferring to drown than to be burned alive. Some sank under the weight of their armor, others caught fire even in the waves. Very few managed to escape to the shore, and the entire invading fleet was destroyed. After the defeat, the main Byzantine navy returned and fell upon the Russians who had landed and were trying to flee with their loot. Once again, fire purified the waters of the barbarians, and the entire expedition ended in complete disaster. Traumatized and without any effective response against the Byzantine weapons, the Russians soon signed a peace treaty on terms favorable to the empire. As the centuries passed, however, the enemies of the Byzantine Empire began to develop partial countermeasures against Greek fire. Maintaining distance, attacking with arrows and projectile artillery was the most obvious strategy. Some commanders tried to attack the fire ships from the rear, where the siphons could not reach them. Others began to cover their ships with hides soaked in water or vinegar, which could absorb part of the heat and delay the spread of the flames. There are reports that around the year 900, the Arabs managed to capture a Byzantine fire ship and tried to reproduce the technology. However, just as had happened with others who had obtained samples of the substance or the equipment, they were unable to replicate the complete system. Their imitations were pale in comparison to the original, insufficient to change the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The effectiveness and terror inspired by Greek fire were so great that the Second Lateran Council, assembled in 1139, went as far as to decree that it was a weapon too deadly to be used among Christians in Europe. This attempt at arms limitation, one of the first recorded in history, had little practical effectiveness, but it bears witness to the terrifying reputation the weapon had acquired even outside the Eastern Mediterranean world. However, no technology lasts forever, and Greek fire was no exception. Around the end of the 12th century, the Byzantine Empire had entered a period of terminal decline. Military defeats, territorial losses, and economic crises undermined the foundations of the state. Many of the regions that traditionally provided the ingredients for Greek fire had been lost, making the production of the substance increasingly difficult and eventually impossible. It is also possible that the formula itself was lost at some point during this turbulent period. The extreme compartmentalization that had protected the secret for centuries now became a vulnerability. If the holders of specific knowledge died without transmitting their information, crucial parts of the process would be irrecuperably lost. Generation after generation, the complete knowledge may have become increasingly fragmented until it disappeared entirely. When the Fourth Crusade diverted from its stated objective of reconquering Jerusalem and attacked Constantinople in 1203, the dragons that had defended the city for more than 5 centuries remained silent. No jet of liquid fire emerged to repel the invaders. The city that had resisted Arabs, Russians, and Bulgars fell before its supposed Christian allies from the west. The flames that had for so long protected Constantinople had finally been extinguished. The legacy of the Byzantine fireships, however, transcended their own existence. The memory of that terrible weapon inspired later generations to seek to recreate its effects. The Venetians, heirs to many Byzantine traditions, developed their own versions of naval incendiary weapons, although they never achieved the devastating effectiveness of the original Greek fire. Other Mediterranean peoples experimented with similar compositions with varying results. In a broader sense, Greek fire represents one of the first examples of how a decisive technological advantage can alter the course of history. If Constantinople had fallen in the sieges of the 7th century or the beginning of the 8th century, the consequences would be incalculable. The Byzantine Empire, which served as a protective shield for Europe for more than 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, would have disappeared centuries before its time. The transmission of classical knowledge to the West, which the Byzantines preserved and eventually shared, could have been interrupted or altered in unpredictable ways. The history of Greek fire also offers us a reflection on the nature of secrecy and knowledge. The Byzantines managed to keep their formula hidden for more than 5 centuries, an extraordinary feat in an era of espionage, betrayal, and capture of prisoners. But this same obsession with secrecy eventually contributed to the irremediable loss of the knowledge. When the secret was guarded so zealously that it became impossible to recover, the weapon that had saved an empire simply ceased to exist. Today, chemists and historians continue to debate the possible components of Greek fire and the methods used to produce and employ it. Some experimental reconstructions have managed to reproduce effects similar to those described in ancient sources, using combinations of naphtha, resins, and quicklime. However, none of these attempts can claim with certainty to have rediscovered the original formula. The secret of Kalinico remains, in the final analysis, a secret. What we know for certain is that, at crucial moments in history, when the fate of entire civilizations hung in the balance, bronze dragons emerged from the prows of Byzantine ships and bathed their enemies in torrents of infernal fire. This image, preserved in the accounts of chroniclers and in the terrified memories of survivors, continues to exert a powerful fascination over our imagination. The next time you contemplate the flames of a bonfire or the fireworks lighting up the night sky, remember that this same element, fire, one day served as the last line of defense between a 1,000-year-old civilization and its complete destruction. Remember the men who operated those bronze siphons under the heat and danger of naval combat, launching jets of destruction upon their enemies. And remember how a single technological innovation, kept in absolute secret for generations, can change the fate of entire nations and peoples. The story of Greek fire is ultimately a story about human ingenuity in the face of adversity. It is about how knowledge, applied with creativity and determination, can compensate for apparently insurmountable disadvantages of numbers and resources. It is about secrets kept with almost religious zeal and eventually lost in the mists of time. And it is about the transformative power of technology, for good and for evil. The dragons of Constantinople no longer patrol the waters of the Bosphorus. Their flames were extinguished many centuries ago, and their secrets were lost with them. But their memory persists, a lasting testimony to an era when fire was both ally and enemy of humanity, and when the fate of empires could be decided by the contents of a single bronze container. If this journey through the history of the Byzantine fire ships awakened your curiosity, if you found yourself transported to those ancient walls while bronze dragons launched hell upon terrified invaders, then our work was successful. But history never truly ends. It only transforms and continues in new forms and narratives. If you wish to continue exploring the mysteries and wonders of the human past, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming documentary narratives. Leave your comment telling which aspect of the history of Greek fire fascinated you the most, or suggest other themes you would like to see explored. And don't forget to like this video if it provided you with knowledge and entertainment, thus helping to spread these extraordinary stories to more people around the world. We will meet on the next trip through time.